Hi everyone. Let's see, I don't have a PC in front of me, so I will glance behind me to remind myself as to what slide I'm up to. So as we said, I'm Lisa Bolton from the Social Research Centre. We currently hold the contract for the QILT suite of surveys, and I'm just going to talk to you today about some very broad insights. We've not got a lot of time. I could probably go for half a day, been known to, so I will attempt very strongly not to do that. Now let's see. Oh, it works. So for those of you who don't know, QILT is a suite of 4 surveys across the student life cycle. So there's the Student Experience Survey, where we survey undergrad and postgrad coursework current students. We do that at commencement and again at completion. So we often hit students twice in their career, their course career. Then we follow them up 4 to 6 months after they've completed their course with the Graduate Outcome Survey, where we look at their outcomes on the basis, so that's employment outcomes but also further education outcomes. We follow them up again 3 years later in the GOS Longitudinal, which is one of my favourite surveys. And we also, our problem child, survey the supervisors of current graduates, where we ask them their actual supervisor details and follow up with their actual supervisors about the skills and knowledge that they've developed through their course. So that's the suite. The Student Experience Survey I will talk about first, to talk about the overall educational experience over the last few years. So mainly on that Student Experience Survey. So essentially, COVID. You can see it's a little exciting dip there. The Student Experience Survey has been running since about 2011, and it is a massive survey. It's something like 200,000 plus responses every year from a sample of anything up to 600,000 students. The scores over the years have been around 80%, 79, 80% since back in the day. It's been very consistent. Because surveys this big, and I'm going to milk this metaphor, it's like turning the Titanic. This shift is an absolutely massive shift. It is gave us so much excitement at the Social Research. It's something to talk about. So you saw a 9 percentage point drop for undergraduate students over that period, which was astonishing. And we have seen in 2021 some recovery, but we're not back to 2019 levels. There is still something about the overall educational experience that students are rating less highly than they did in 2019 and prior. What we also know is that there are a number of focus areas in the Student Experience Survey. There's teaching quality, there's learner engagement, learning resources, skills development and student support. Learner engagement, I always say with air quotes, it's a loose a sort of affiliation of items. It's always worth looking into them. They're not statistical scales, it's worth remembering. But the biggest driver of the overall educational experience, and if anyone here is surprised, I'll go he, is teaching quality. We all go, nice. But learner engagement and learning resources took on more importance in the students' decisions about their overall experience in 2020 and again in 2021. And in 2021 we saw an increase in student support as an influence on the overall experience. So that's unsurprising because that was the first year we had a full COVID year from application through to induction. Like prior to that, when COVID hit, a lot of that activity had already happened. Now in this one we see that it is a change mainly driven by students who had intended to be on campus. So there are problems with study mode as a data point because of what we get through HEMS and TAXI, but certainly we can see the trend that students who had intended to study fully or partly on campus had the biggest drop in 2020, and they've recovered somewhat, but they're still well below previous levels in terms of their evaluation of their overall educational experience. Institutions that had less than 20% of their delivery online prior to COVID were the ones that took the biggest hits. Big institutions, big international enrolments, not a lot of online learning prior, where their staff and their students had not had much experience of online learning, and the change in terms of their curriculum was quite profound in the shifts that they needed to make. It's a bit like, I'm going back to my Titanic metaphor, the iceberg of online disruption had been floating about for a while, but suddenly it was there. And a lot of institutions had to deal with it very quickly and make some really serious and rapid changes. The learner engagement focus area, which is the one that talks a lot about students working together collaboratively, either in class or outside class. A lot of criticism of this set of questions. However, what we did see that dropped by about 16 percentage points, and it's only recovered in 2021 by about 5. Students are still not working together as much as they used to, in class or outside class. As well, there's a couple of questions in the teaching quality set which talk about academic staff engaging with students and also about whether the course was well structured. So we saw a drop in those items in 2020 and some recovery in 2021, but we can see the relationship between that engagement, that two-way engagement with staff, that is lining up with that learner engagement stuff. I think what we're seeing here is about engagement, that engagement with other students and staff as a two-way relationship is really more important to students than perhaps we're giving it credit for, particularly in an online space. We asked a question in a set of extra questions we added in 2020 about response to COVID. We asked 2 questions. One was about how much help and support they'd had to engage or to study online, and the other question was around how much help and support they'd had to collaborate online. And less than half of students said they'd had any reference to that at all. And so what we're seeing there is a change in the way that people are engaging with other people within their study, and maybe there's something intrinsic to the overall educational experience that we're perhaps not managing to really capture in that new model. International students have, over time, had lower ratings of their overall experience than domestic by about 4 percentage points. And that's been true for many years. It's kind of flown under the radar. We don't seem to have addressed it, or at least it hasn't shifted by much. But what we saw in 2020 was an even bigger drop. So they dropped until they were about, how many percent is that? 7 percentage points lower than domestic students in 2020, and that's after that precipitous drop. And they've recovered at about the same rate as domestic, but they're still languishing quite a bit lower than prior to COVID. What we saw in 2020 and 2021 was an increase in the number of international students that were studying online offshore. They were feeling particularly isolated. When you read the comments of those students, they were feeling like they had no engagement with their institution. It wasn't what they'd signed up for. They were really cross they weren't here. And it was that engagement that they were missing. What we know about international students is they are often more reliant on their university campus for their social needs, their community needs, their learning needs and spaces, their equipment needs and spaces, and also that they're more likely to rate their overall experience of living in Australia by their ability to make friends. And what we see is that the smaller institutions, the non-university, of which we've got 100-odd, 130 or something in QILT, were doing better in that space, where students were saying that they were making friends as part of their experience in Australia, whereas we see the universities, the international students are more struggling to be able to do that. But with a third of them offshore in 2021, something like 9,000 odd of them, they were having even more difficulty engaging with their studies. Oh, next one. So now I'm just going to leap off into graduate outcomes, because we don't have a lot of time and I know I'm jumping about. So I'm just going to talk to you about some of the data we're getting from the Graduate Outcomes Survey longitudinal. So that came out. We've got 2022 data. That one looks from students who completed their course around 2018. We surveyed in 2019. and now 3 years later, what's happened? So what we see is that in the short term, more generalist study areas tend to have higher full-time employment rates. So this, and you'll have these slides, I'm sorry I'm jumping through so complex a slide so quickly, but you see things like humanities, science and mathematics, a number of those study areas actually have quite low full-time employment rates straight out of the blocks 4 to 6 months after they completed. A lot of those study areas also have quite high further study rates. So science and mathematics, I think it's something like 38% are in further full-time study after an undergrad degree. Don't think anyone wants someone building us a bridge who's just launched out with an undergrad, bright-eyed and bushy-tailed. Humanities as well, about a quarter of them are in further full-time study. So there's that to factor in as well. But what we see is that 3 years later, those more generalist study areas do tend to catch up. So it's not that these people are not employed and not employable, it just takes them a bit longer to access the labour market compared to the more vocational areas like, they hate me saying this, medicine, rehab, nursing, teaching, where it's almost a straight path through. And you can see that level of increase at that bottom line. So that's how much each of these has increased. So those study areas down the bottom are tending to catch up over that 3-year period. So I was just going to touch on a couple of issues that stuck out to me from our data. So one is that the gender pay gap starts early. So you can see, particularly postgrad coursework, there's a very large gender pay gap 4 to 6 months after they've completed their course. Part of that for postgrad coursework is that a lot of those students are already engaged in the labour market and have been for some time. So these are not people where their postgraduate qualification is their first foray into the labour market. They tend to be working and coming back to study. Tends to have a higher proportion of online students who are already working, that kind of cohort. When we control for that a bit, that gap actually comes down substantially. 3 years later, those gaps get bigger. So what we know is that female students are more likely to be working part-time but satisfied with their hours. They tend to work a lot of part-time hours, particularly in teaching and nursing. But that then can affect their ability to look for promotions, pay rises and that sort of stuff. And over the time in the labour market, females are actually falling further and further behind in terms of salaries. If we look at the WGEA, I think I've got that initial right, data, their data supports that, and they actually use QILT data in their analyses about gender pay gap. But certainly you can see it in the Goss longitudinal. And that leads to some thinking about what we can do as a sector to assist females in the labour market to bridge those gaps. International students, I don't have a good news story here. The short-term employment rates, full-time employment rates for international students are extremely low and remain quite low. We'll see an increase in 2022 for the Graduate Outcome Survey, but a rising tide floats all boats. That gap still exists and is quite large. So you can see there's like a 20 percentage point gap between domestic students and international. International students who go back overseas actually did much better than students who remained onshore in Australia and tried to find work. It's also the case that they are to some degree underemployed, so they're less likely to be working in professional and managerial occupations than their domestic counterparts for undergraduate students. And 3 years later, they've caught up quite a bit. It's not as bad a news story as it could have been, but certainly they're still not quite as able to access professional and managerial positions, and less likely to be working in areas that are fully utilising their skills and qualifications, skills and knowledge. For those of you who wonder, postgrad coursework, those numbers are probably even worse. Number one, because postgrad coursework, domestic students more likely to have been attached to the workforce for longer, but also those postgrad coursework international students, it's like it's their first degree. It's not like they've been engaged with the labour market or have those networks in place. For domestic undergrads, the reasons they're working in areas that aren't fully utilising their skills and knowledge, quite a large proportion of them, 3 years later, have said that that's because they're satisfied with their current job. They're working in jobs that aren't necessarily using their qualification fully, but that's because they're choosing to, and that's all right. However, 18% of them have said that they've got not enough work experience, and this is 3 years after they've completed their qualification. If we look at international students, not enough work experience goes up to 27%. So that's more than a quarter. One in 4 of those international graduates 3 years later are saying if they're working in areas that aren't utilising their skills and knowledge, it's because they don't have enough work experience. And I think there are messages in all of this that speak to the sorts of programs we have on university and higher education campuses to support our international students once they're starting to access the labour market. So there's a question that's not in the national report that we've popped in here that we've started reporting on informally this year. Thinking about your original decision to complete your qualification, if you had to make this choice again, would you study? So here we go. The same qualification at the same institution, same qualification, different institution, same subject area. But then the red ones, the more reddy flavoured, something completely different at the same institution, something completely different at a different institution, or not study at all. So this is 3 years after they've completed that qualification. And what we see here is that about 20% of domestic students, 3 years after they've completed, are saying they would either study something completely different or not study at all. That's 1 in 5 graduates who did the GOS longitudinal. So that's a problem. International students, on the other hand, we're looking at, 15, 26, 20, whatever number that is. So it's quite a few more students saying that they would study something completely different or not study at all. If we look here at postgrad coursework, we see a very similar pattern. Again, remembering probably a little more attached to the labour market for longer for domestic students, but for those international students, that is a frighteningly high number, 28, 34%. That's a big number. A third of international graduates 3 years after they've completed are saying they would have done something completely different. So I think that speaks to things around career support, career education, things to do with supporting students in how to get jobs, how to apply in the Australian cultural context, etc., that perhaps we're not doing as well as we might. So, went really quick to allow for questions. Where to from here? The QILT data is a rich source of data. The surveys are not necessarily the best they absolutely could be. The SES is currently under review, and I'm hoping there'll be some little tweaks to improve that one. But certainly it is a big set of surveys with still very robust response rates that give you benchmarkable data. Every institution has their institution data back. It's a time series file, you've got it going back a number of years that you can investigate and base strategies in your institution on how you might address some of these issues. So, a good response. A lot of institutions get the QILT data and their senior management go, we've only got 47% for learner engagement, do something. But in fact, you really need to investigate this data a little more. You need to get into what are the main indicators underneath that. Is it about students working with other students? Is it about international students not being engaged and being in like a ghetto campus and not engaging with domestic students? What are the issues in your specific institution that might be driving some of these results? We give every institution a Tableau package workbook. Straight out of the box, you can start investigating all of these items right down to international, domestic, gender, disability, diversity, any other diversity groups. It's all there for institutions to engage with. We also give you your verbatim comments back. You can look at what students actually said. So if you find that your students are complaining, your international students on a particular campus are saying they're unhappy with one of the indicators, you can look and see what they said. We see a lot of students going, why do the Chinese students get special classes and we from Malaysia don't? And things like that. So you can then engage with those groups directly. You can run focus groups with them. And I can tell you, when you run focus groups with disgruntled groups of students, when you co-create solutions, you get better bang for your buck than ever the solution was going to give you. Engaging the students in this activity also increases your response rates. If they know that you take it seriously, if they know that you act on the results and that they're part of the process, your response rates could hit 60%. When you pay no attention at all, 30 maybe, if you're lucky. Other surveys, additional modules in QILT, you can always put extra stuff in QILT, not too much, please, oh my God. But as well, go with an evaluation process, trial some strategies with particular groups and then look at your QILT data and see if you made a difference. I went to one institution, did a presentation for them, and I could see that their feedback on assessment item had increased markedly in 1 year. And I mentioned that to them, said, clearly you are doing something in the feedback on assessment space. One woman in the room just vibrated with excitement because that was her project. And she had implemented a new feedback on assessment system in their institution, and you could see the results. Just a shout out to UTS, even though Shirley's retired from there. But their student collaborative learning program that they have, you can see from their students engaging more with other students in that learner engagement scale, you can see it in the data, but you can also see the 2 items in skills development that are most associated with that learner engagement set, spoken communication and working with others, were also much higher for those cohorts that had engaged in that collaborative learning. So we see those associations. And where students have engaged in those learner engagement activities, we see those skills ranking higher, and we also see that persist through the graduate survey, the graduate outcome survey longitudinal, and the employer survey. Where students study externally and haven't done those learner engagement activities, we see that persist in terms of that skills development, right down to employer comments around collaborative skills development. So these are all important things that you can investigate and do something about. And so just different activities. One might be to engage your international students with your domestic students in your business course, because that's the biggest study area for international students. Get them to do a shared assessment where they have to, I don't know, investigate and research business practices in other countries. And they have to find a student from that country and interview them about their experience in their own country. And the international students to do that with Australian students. Get them into relationships with each other. Have a barbecue. That kind of thing. It makes a difference, and it seems that it is intrinsic to the students' evaluation of their overall educational experience. And we have to, even if we're pulling them back on campus, what is it about that on-campus experience that makes it worth coming? Because I remember the days of shooting a gun at my higher education campus, particularly on a Friday, and you wouldn't have hit a soul. So what is it that brings them to the lectures, or what brings them to the campus? And I think what we're seeing, to some degree, is that this engagement component of their courses is more important than we gave it credit for. So thanks. Questions, I think.
So a question from online was around, what does the data say about the experience of disabled students?
It's a small group. What we see, there's one of the questions in the survey and the SES called considered leaving, and we do see that students with disabilities were more likely in the past 12 months to have considered leaving, and that there are some health and wellbeing issues, particularly for that group. It is an area that you can explore in your QILT data, but on the whole, they're fairly well represented as a group in the data set, but I'm not seeing really big differences in the data, just from memory. But certainly it is an area that you can investigate, and you can utilise QILT data to do further research in your institution, but also more generally across the sector. That is all doable.
Thanks so much. There's actually a lot of questions. We might just take one because of timing, but...
I do my best work at lunch.
I know. I think also you've got the chat. Pop them in the chat and we'll make Lisa answer them in there as well. Down the back here is one. Sorry, just the one. Oh my goodness.
I'm Asha Ramzan. I'm not from the tertiary education sector. We have an international student support service for New South Wales and I manage an NGO. One of the things that strikes me is that disjunct between what international students pay for their education and their outcomes in terms of their ability to secure a well-paid job. And more than a third of international students stay on in Australia. And you know, I keep getting driven around Sydney and other places by people with a degree, international student, who couldn't secure a job, and we also have social work students on placement with us, and the only conclusion I can come to is that this is bias or racism, and I'm wondering, I'm just going to call it out, I'm wondering what institutions, tertiary institutions that are so hungry for international students, what are they doing about industry bias for equivalent degrees, which doesn't create good pathways for international students into employment?
With my Lisa hat on, rather than my QILT hat on, yes, most of my Uber drivers are international students, and when they say, what do you do, they don't let me out of the cab when we go to the Uber when we get to where because they want to tell me all about it. I think when I go to conferences about these issues, they talk about a lack of networks for international students, a lack of experience around applying for jobs, the Australian cultural context for how you apply for jobs, the language difficulties, a lack of confidence in language, but also the phrase at the conference was, not my words, the inherent racism of the Australian labour market. And what we see in the 2022 GOS and the 2021 Graduate Outcomes Survey, we've had a bit of a change in one of our scales. A lot of students are saying that they haven't got a job using their skills and knowledge because they don't have permanent residency. And employers are telling them they won't employ them if they don't have permanent residency. I think there is, therefore, if we're looking at strategies, scope in the sector to be engaging with employers, with the graduate employer networks, to educate employers in Australia as to why it's beneficial to employ international students. Gen, I don't know what we're up to, apparently it's Alpha, Gen, whoever they are now, are looking to make impact. They're looking to change their jobs. They're not staying, as I did for like 30 years at one employer. International students are not more difficult than that. And so they bring a richness and a diversity to employment areas, particularly where we're talking about diversity. And certainly I think there are things that the sector can do to better prepare our international students for that job market. But it's only been the last couple of years that we've even reported this. Prior to this, graduate outcomes were only domestic. So this is the first year we've even talked about international students in that longitudinal survey. So I think it's worth paying attention to and something that we'll be looking into and doing a bit more insights work on over the next year or two.
Excellent. Thank you so much,
Thanks.
Lisa. That was fascinating.
Secret.
Round of applause. Thank you.